terms of economic development assistance, and also how it's going to impact the economy. Where are the growth sectors, what industries might be formed. You are as a business vet Brad Fallon. He is the deputy legislative officer for the governor. He gets to spend some time at the General Assembly, interfacing with our friends in the House of Delegates and the Senate. So I'm going to let Brad introduce himself a little bit, tell a little bit about his background, and he's going to jump in to talk about the governor's growth agenda, and then hopefully we can field some questions and have a nice dialogue and answer any concerns or comments you may have. So Brad, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and thank you all for having me this morning. We've been doing a lot of these this year, which is exciting, candidly, because when I was wrapping up the legislative session last year, when we were staring down this deficit incoming, I did not expect to be able to talk about. So we're excited about that. As Mark said, my name is I'm development, housing, business regulation, pretty much anything that honestly this body might care about. Um, we are in a really interesting moment right now because, as Mark mentioned, we have a $3 billion deficit. We will have our next revenue estimates coming out at the beginning of March. And candidly, given what is coming out of Washington and the impact, particularly in Anne Arundel County, with such a large percentage of the workforce working directly for the federal government or working for a contractor, but really statewide, I am very eagerly but nervously waiting to see what our revenue estimates look like in a couple weeks. That is going to decide a lot about what happens for the rest of session, but also for the rest of the year. And that is an interesting place for the administration to approach that we have legislative agenda on some of these things approaching both more broadly get at this interesting point of where are we being smart on business environment, on policy, and the way that we are approaching things while also focusing on prioritizing those investments. I think it is very, very clear that we would not be in the budgetary mess that we're in right now if our economy had grown in a rate that is more equal to the national average. Our economy's been about stagnant for about a decade, where economic growth has been about 2% through that period. We have some real bright spots within that. We have some real success stories that we can point to and that we owe, candidly, folks like this organization and EDOs for really paving the pathway for. But we have not seen our economy grow in the way that the national economy has, or really the region. And if we not we revenue in Annapolis has come to the realization that in order to long term get to a more stable place, we are going to have to grow the economy. Again, like I said, when we finished the last legislative session where there was a lot of attention on particular housing, I did not expect to come in this year with momentum on economic development. I thought, man, I'm going to have an easy session. We are going to, get a few good things done, largely on business environment, and we'll see what happens. I was really encouraged to see the conversations that took place over the legislative interim, both with leadership in the legislative branch as well as in the executive branch, fundamentally coming to that recognition that we have to make those investments and they have to come now. And so that's why when the governor announced his budget last month, it included and that I'll speak a little bit more when I get into the Decade Act that the governor is bringing, which is a sweeping reform and comes with quite a bit of nuance. In addition to that, the governor in the lead up to session has taken quite a bit of action to start laying down the foundation for things that we don't need to accomplish through legislation. Whether that was his executive order that he signed back in December that did things like create the Maryland Coordinated Permitting Review Council. For those who are familiar with the FAST 41 Council at the federal level, it's very similar. It is coordinated permitting reform. It is not sexy stuff. We put folks to sleep talking about it, candidly. but it is what I believe is truly impactful, which is bringing together those local governments, the state government, and the federal government, and ensuring that if whether companies and project sponsors know who to contact to and have assigned staff, particularly the Department of Planning, as a single point of entrance and a point of contact to move through that process. We also created things like the Certified Sites program at Medco that helps ensure that our sites are ready for development. This is something that states like Virginia have been doing for quite some time for a lot of success. When they have a business that's expanding or when they want to be competitive about attracting businesses to the state, they need sites to show that we have all the baseline work and the baseline permitting that they can come and we can work directly with those site placement firms to help with that attraction effort. It includes things like creating the Maryland Advanced Air Mobility Council, uh, which is truly look position a the been thinking about for a while, right? The Uber drones or the DoorDash drones or the Amazon drones coming around are finally going to be legal in 2025. Maryland is really interestingly well positioned to dominate both in the manufacturing, but really the initial deployment of that industry, both for civilian use and use, but need to establish some baseline regulatory structure. We can set up that standard, make sure that we have attraction efforts, and see if in the long term that industry is able to grow here in the States. The governor last session created what we call the Government Efficiency Commission. Again, this is permitting and licensing reform, where we took a comprehensive review of all of the permits, licenses, and certifications that the state issues. Believe it or not, we have never had a list of that. The state has never tracked all of the approvals that it has to issue and the performance of those until now. We now have a catalog. We issue about 1,300 approvals through permits, license certifications. Obviously, that comes in with many, many tens of thousands each year. And we were able to identify where the problem points are and kind of what is to that was the idea that those that or the MDE voluntary cleanup program permits, right? Things that tend to be a bottleneck for development to work with folks to figure out how do we get to a more consistent timeline where we have better communication, where we are more transparent about what to expect and about what those standards are to move us through the process. I bring this up in this group because often these are things that do not get a lot of political celebration, but are things that I think are some of the most fundamentally important things that a government can do to make sure that when we set these regulatory processes, that when we set these enforcement provisions, that they work, that they are good government. And in a true sense, this is largely about things like updating our IT systems to make sure that the staff at these empowered to deliver and make it. So that can work continue led that effort. I work with a few colleagues to staff that commission, and it is charging ahead on 10 priority permits, licenses, and certifications as kind of a proof of concept. We requested about $1.5 million in the budget, and the governor submitted that at the beginning of session to help kickstart that initiative and really show what scalability looks like so that we can continue that march through state government and then beyond to work with our local governments to make sure that there is more synergy between the two as we're working with the business community. I mentioned the budget. There are a few things I point out before I get too deeply into the legislation, which is some strategic bets that the state is just not accustomed to making. Some of you may be familiar with a account from that the state owns called the Sunny Day account or the Sunny Day Fund. That is that when we are trying to attract folks to the state. Several Months ago, the governor made an agreement with the University of Maryland and a quantum computing firm called IonQ in College Park. And through the investments and things like the Sunny Day account, we were able to pull together the federal government, the University of Maryland, and private investment for a committed $1 billion investment over the next 5 years in College Park in quantum computing. Now, I'll talk a lot about return on investment, particularly as I get to the Decade Act, but this is a place where I think we have to shift our thinking just a bit. Quantum computing is not going to turn around tomorrow a massive return on investment, but we are never going to get ahead if we don't make those longer term bets into proving that we have a robust economy here in the state where we can have a emerging in being which trust that those that are interested to just show that we are ready for business for things that we can announce $1 billion and later that night get on CNBC to make sure that the rest of the country knows that this is a place to invest and that we want to make sure that we are breaking some of the molds of a state with a poor business environment. We've also done more administrative things. We just went through a reorganization of the Department of Commerce. That was a fundamental change to the way that we are doing business there. Whether that was just restructuring who's in charge of which units. We brought in a new leadership team. We created the Governor's Office of Business Advancement to certainly be that ombudsman between the business community and the state so that there is a central access point when folks are in need, whether that's because a permit or license issue uh, or whether investment. For a long time, we continued to put money into programs that were not being fully subscribed and often not subscribed at even 10%. And so when we have limited resources, we are putting money into programs, and some of these are quite high, 10, $20 million, that are just not being utilized. And when you peel back a little bit, when you really track that return on investment, when you track where that money is going and why it's not getting out the door, it's pretty easy to tell that there were some policy changes that we could make that would make this more appealing both for the business community, but also for the state to continue to make those cases on the return on investment that comes back, even in the most government terms of every dollar out the door returns some tax revenue value. Executive order, he included investment. He is very driven agencies that have shared goals. What this will do is pull together through our economic competitiveness subcabinet all the agencies that are touching onto business development, broader economic development, community development, and housing, track that return on investment across, find places for synergy, and make continued policy changes when we realize that a program is underperforming. It's also just tracking the indicators of how our economy is doing. We really last year came out of the gate hard on housing. This is something that has a continued issue. I know I worked with some folks on this call on that, and it's something on March that we have continued in this session. But I'll be candid, when we got out of the last legislative session, we did very close to home. A lot of folks can emotional debate, but it's worth it. What we know is that Maryland is one of the least affordable housing markets in the entire country. And when you look at our migration patterns, we're starting to shrink. And I think most concerningly to me, 2/3 of the outmigration is folks between the ages of 17 and 34. And it's really concentrated there in the middle of folks that grow up here, go to our universities, get their workforce training here, and then move out of state. And when you track where they are moving, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a lot of this data tracking and have been a wonderful partner in this, it is to more affordable housing markets. Largely that's down south, but that's even to our neighbors in Pennsylvania, places like Pittsburgh, where you can certainly live a lot cheaper than DC. And I live in Baltimore, and you can certainly live there a lot cheaper than Baltimore. That are our budget choose today. are created by our significant. The governor believes, and certainly this administration believes, that those investments are very critical. It does make you pause and ask, what are we really investing in? That group is called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. If Maryland's future is moving out of the state at such a high rate, we have to reassess to make sure those investments are long-term impacting our economy and the quality of life in the state. And so when we track why folks are moving the state, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the state itself has done surveys to see what is a motivating factor for folks to leave. And there are two reasons that are cited more than anything else that's not even close. It's commute times and it's the price of housing. That, in my view, are very intimately connected because we do not have kind of robust public transportation in the way that some of our friends up north have done in kind of the New England also centralization near where the jobs are, particularly in the middle class kind of bracket, whether they are teachers, whether they are cops, whether they are nurses, cannot afford to live in a lot of the places where the jobs are clustered. And largely that's in central Maryland. And so, really starting with that premise and recognizing that we needed to approach housing in the state, we got to work on figuring out a way to best target housing infrastructure to support the jobs economy. And over several months, working with stakeholders, that ultimately became a piece of legislation that the governor's introduced this session called the Housing for Jobs Act. And fundamentally, what that does is that it looks at each region of the state of Maryland, the Baltimore region, the Washington region, Southern Maryland, Western Maryland, Upper Eastern Shore, Lower Eastern Shore. And it takes a inventory of all the jobs, the housing, and then we can we know from decades of research by housing unit for every job available in a region. But if you get above about 1.5 to 1, you really start to see cascading effects, both in terms of affordability of housing, but also on the ability of folks and businesses to grow based off of the workforce availability. And so we applied that standard to the state, and we found kind of what we expected. A lot of the state and the rural communities are below that 1.5 to 1 ratio of jobs to housing, but Central Maryland is not. The Baltimore region and the Washington region is pretty far off by the multitude of 150,000 units or so. And so, what that tells us is that we do not have the housing infrastructure to support the jobs economy, and certainly not for the folks who work those jobs. And what we know is how the costs on America. And so, when that that will continue to see both the demand for higher wages to be drawn up, but also folks motivated to leave the state. And so what this legislation does is that once it identifies whether there is a gap between jobs and housing, it assigns a target to each local jurisdiction located within those regions, and then it sets new standards for what housing production looks like. It sets a new timeline for when decisions must be reached. It also establishes that a local jurisdiction should default to yes on new development unless there is a compelling reason to deny that outweighs the harm created by the lack of housing. And we specifically define those. We are really taking out the subjective nature of the regulatory environment related to housing production. And what we're for denial. What that is concerns once there based upon how things are districted, as well as just objective development standards. Fundamentally, what the bill says is that if objective standards are met at the time of a application for a project, that they can move forward. And that we cannot then later, a year down the line, 2 years down the line, pull the rug out and say that we are fundamentally changing a site. I think the poster child for this is really maybe a development that was just killed in Baltimore County called Lutherville Station. There is an abandoned mall right next to a light rail station. It hits two pieces. We need redevelopment and adaptive reuse, and we also need to get folks more access to transit-oriented developments and public transportation to kind of hit those two motivating factors why folks should leave. At one point endorsed and was a new mall to build that. Candidly, just about a dozen neighbors from across the street. The county ultimately downzoned the site about a year and a half into the project and completely killed any progress on it. That is something that is not totally rare, right? We see folks, and I get it. It's members of the county council, unlike us, go to Safeway and get yelled at, right? But if folks don't like something going on in the community, which in large part is good, but what that has meant over decades, and this is not in just Maryland, it truly we're seeing it across the country, is that that has led to a place where we have a fundamental insufficient stock of housing. It's driving the cost way up, and it's making the prospect of homeownership, particularly for the younger generation, so far out of mind that a lot of folks are just not even preparing for it. And what the and so this is something that we have to address. We have the Maryland Chamber of Commerce has made housing for jobs a top priority for them this session. They will join the governor at the panel on March 4th. And we welcome, of course, any of the local Chamber of Commerce to come in and weigh in on support on this as well. Another piece of legislation is very intimately connected, which is the RAISE Act, which touches on the workforce development. And the reason I say it's so connected is just about weekly, the governor has conversations with members of the business community. Sometimes it's very large businesses in the state, sometimes it's small businesses. That's something that he feels very strongly about, and just make sure that he has a finger on the pulse of the challenges that folks are facing. And often I sit with him for these meetings and really just to kind of intake what could that call, business leaders are going to say that one of their top forces states, because that prospect is a top concern of mine, especially when you look at a state of Maryland that has more expensive real estate than some other places where they may consider moving. And so we are at a place now where, per the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, we only have 33 workers looking for jobs in the workforce for every 100 available jobs. For things like cybersecurity, we're at a point now where we have an insufficiency of 30,000 jobs, meaning that we have 30,000 open positions where we have no stock to fill those jobs in the state. And you can find a lot of kind of anecdotal pieces across sectors in the state where Maryland should really be excelling, but we just don't have the adequate workforce. In my opinion, it's inexcusable given that we have fantastic schools, attention, college career. One of those is apprenticeships. And it's something the governor feels very strongly about scaling up. When I think about apprentices often, I think of building trades. I think of folks like electricians or plumbers and kind of these more traditional sectors that folks use to train up, though it's become very clear. And there is really a movement building that we can expand that out beyond just those traditional sectors to non-traditional sectors to benefit both the individual businesses, but also the apprentices who may not be interested in going through college and figuring out and incurring so much debt along the way, but would be interested on-the-job learning where they can get paid and earn while they learn. And so what that looks like is that we brought a bill called the RAISE Act. And what that bill does is it creates $1 million a year to start out on a few programs that I'll go into detail to ORAD that will really be focused on being the bridge at the Department of Commerce between the business community, apprentices, and the regulatory side of things. What that looks like is working with individual businesses and saying, hey, I know that you have workforce needs. Is it possible that this fits for you? Then connecting them to a program of qualified intermediaries, which are sort of like, as I see it, a concierge service for individual businesses that might be interested in adopting an apprenticeship model to help both develop that curriculum, develop kind of the sites on site that they need for instruction, developing connections with an academic institution, usually community colleges, so that there is classroom teaching along with the experiential learning, and connecting directly. We've created in the Maryland That will is it investments. It helps de-risk that investment, particularly while folks are figuring out whether this model is something that works for them and their workforce needs. We have seen a lot of interest in non-traditional sectors, whether that is media companies, cybersecurity firms, broader IT. We actually have a hearing on this bill today, and our Lieutenant Governor Aruna Miller is going to be leading the panel, and she's going to be joined by two apprentices. One individual, a guy named Nate Fink from Frederick County, was an apprentice that was in part funded by the state at a place called Dynamic Auto. It is a automotive mechanic shop in Frederick. That is your more traditional type of apprenticeship. By the time he completed his registered apprenticeship, he had a full-time job. He also had about 60 college credits and not now has had experience, made money while he did so, came out with no, I am going to go to college and I'm going to finish out this engineering degree, which is something that we love to hear because it ensures that we have both a trained workforce, but we're opening opportunities for folks to earn while they learn and make those career changes as they see fit in a measurable way. But it also defrays costs. I'm sorry, actually, I should mention first, we have an addition on that panel, a gentleman named Samit Dave, who is not your traditional apprentice. He was not a young man when he came out. He started his apprenticeship program in his 50s. He had worked in a hospital setting for most of his career, and then really kind of fell on hard times. He couldn't find a job, and so working with Howard Community College and AT&T, he started an apprenticeship for kind of some of these baseline IT type of work, and now has just received a job within NSA, and is on his way a security clearance career where he's making more money started that we can really choose where we know that we have potential. That really is across the board. There has been about 2 years of analysis at the governor's direction to determine where these big bets, where these high growth industry sectors that Maryland really has a leg up on, that if we just invest in, we can really be a capital of. Some of those things are cybersecurity, right? It's no surprise to folks in Anne Arundel County that both between our military institutions and our other federal facilities, we really have high potential when it comes to cybersecurity. We are one of the leading states in the country, despite that 30,000 job shortage that I mentioned earlier, and that can continue to grow. There was a lot of attention late last year when Congress decided to allow the U.S. senators state deal, which includes some folks as odd, but it had a major impact on continued federal funding. But something that got less covered was an expanded cyber unit. That is not done in a silo, and it wasn't done by accident. Just about 2 weeks ago, we had a new Secretary of Commerce start for the state. It was formally and actually fresh off of being the White House cyber director, the national cyber director for the country, which is an unorthodox background for a Secretary of Commerce. But it's become very clear to me why the governor selected him to lead this department, because I have seen that he knows the folks. He knows where the industries are headed. He has kind of a first name basis relationship with leaders of all sorts of tech companies, small and middle and large, around the country. We kind of understand where we can launch investment. Like I mentioned, there was analysis done over 2 years about where the small group of sectors that we can invest in when we look at things like the innovation sector, where we can expect over the next 10 years real growth. In his executive order, he named those. We call those our lighthouse sectors, and that included life sciences, in particular biocomputing. That included IT, that includes quantum computing, AI, and cybersecurity, and it includes aerospace and defense, in particular things I mentioned before, position, navigation, and timing, or kind of our aerial drones. That will not touch every business in the state, but it will impact the broader kind of perception of the state as a place where the economy is moving. It also has effects through the supply chain for each of those. Underlying and the last last decade into for the state and supporting, as I really see, kind of an enabling sector for these other industries to work well. We're also concentrating our efforts on innovation sectors in a more targeted way. The Governor's Decade Act, which I'll go into more detail in a minute, in part allows the Secretary of Commerce to annually set a list of target industry sectors in the innovation space. We have all sorts of innovation focused programs in the state of Maryland. We have a program called Build Our Future that helps build out innovation infrastructure, things like SCIFs or advanced manufacturing facilities. We have RISE zones that are like little tech hubs around our federal facilities or our universities. We have a Manufacturing 4.0 grant program that specifically looks at advanced manufacturing. And we have investments in companies in particular about for each of these or how they work with one another. And so part of a kind of our more comprehensive review was ensuring that when we lean in on something, that we are really using all levers of government to make sure that we're not giving everybody kind of 5% of what they need, but we are giving a pool of high potential sectors really everything that they need while improving the broader business climate to start moving us in the direction that we need to go so that we can pick up that momentum and continue to make broad-based progress as we move forward. Those sectors will include things like manufacturing, aerospace manufacturing, in particular, has been a major focus both in Western Maryland, actually, I should say all Lower Eastern Shore, Southern Maryland, and Western Maryland, who each have unique assets. So includes things like that and has really contributed to the growth in Frederick County as it continues to push out west to make sure that we have really concentrated focus across our programs. Beyond that, the Decade Act makes a bunch of what would otherwise be somewhat boring changes to a lot of programs. We do have annually our Department of Legislative Services does program evaluations for programs that the state issues, largely tax credits. And they're very good, and often they do go unread, candidly. Folks like me get hired to sit there and read through reports like this. And honestly, they often are filled with a lot of good stuff. What we're able to do then is take a program evaluation. I'll take the Buy Maryland cyber tax credit, utilize at about 10% a year. We put $4 million. So we look at the DLS program evaluation. We work with the Cybersecurity Association. We work with programmatic staff at the department, and we work with some of our folks like at the Maryland Tech Council and individual firms and find a path ahead to make sure we are strengthening that program to ensure that if we are continuing to put money into it each year, that is actually returning the results that we need. That is one example of what really the Decade Act is overall. It is the longest bill I have ever led on. It is 170 pages. It'll probably end up over 200 pages before the end of session. If anybody here has read it, you have my undying respect because it takes a long time, candidly. And I did send out to Mark. And Mark, if you haven't shared, please feel free to. Really the programs to make sure and that we are tracking these programs and structuring them in such a way that we can continue to come back to the table and make the good case to appropriators that we need to invest more deeply to continue to grow Maryland's economy. There are components of that not everybody will love, honestly, and that includes some sunsets. There are programs that are being eliminated. Candidly, it always pains me to see an economic development or a business development tool being sunset. But in this budgetary environment, when everything is under the microscope, when everything needs to be defended, and candidly, if we get to March 1st and we have any sort of revenue write down, that will only be enhanced. We have to be able to come in and make a good faith case to keep these programs. The only program that are Act to be eliminated are ones where we're on this call may be familiar with have very good anecdotal evidence, but in the last few program evaluations and candidly in similar programs in other states, we're not able to actually prove quantitatively that it has a one, strong return on investment, and two, is incentivizing behavior. That also includes things like the One Maryland tax credit program. Anne Arundel County is not eligible for that program, so it doesn't impact businesses in this county, but it's very similar to a job creation tax credit program. That's one where, by the structure of the program and the 15-year timeline that it sets on, there is no ability to prove any sort of return on investment. So we're going to hear anecdotal debates on the budget and on this legislation about that program. But that is the way that we have been approaching things. If we cannot prove that it is, we look, if you're going to cut something, there are a few programs, including NEDAF, that folks may be familiar here, that go underutilized. We put about $20 million a year into that program. It's been about half utilized in recent years. That can offer grants or loans, particularly for job creation, retention, and expansion efforts, and is really designed to be a nimble tool, but has really over the years become very administratively burdensome and costly to local jurisdictions, particularly those that are strapped for cash right now. What we did in the bill is that we took out all sort of administrative processes, including additional approval processes internal to the administration. We increased the amount of assistance that can come from that program as grants and loans from $5 million to $7.5 million. And we took away the required 10% match from a local jurisdiction for funds to be expended. I think the state these and move forward with a local voice and what their community looks like, but we shouldn't make it a financial burden for them that they did not plan for to be able to move forward in the investments that the state is interested in making. I do think that that is going to be important moving forward as we have even these permitting and licensing conversations to show that there is a real partnership between these two bodies that often in the state of Maryland, for whatever reason, because we're so proud of our local counties and identify with them, often gets splintered up and we end up with 24 different approaches to growth in what is candidly a very small state. The last piece of legislation in the growth agenda is called the Procurement Reform Act. That bill is very long as well. In procurement, it is 60 pages, and 60 pages in procurement is very deep and very in the weeds. It looks to do is modernize our procurement process. Expand these for small businesses. The floor on dollars are set aside for small businesses to compete on. We are both looking to reduce that floor down to $1 so that even these $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 contracts are available for particularly our small businesses to be, again, able to start building their reputation, building their experience, and get some revenue through the door, and also increase the reserve limit up to $1 million so that small businesses can compete for these larger contracts, the $800,000, $900,000, $1 million contracts moving forward. It also does some things that, again, are not sexy. It makes some very administrative changes to the way that we are processing things to make sure that our procurement process can move more quickly. It focuses on things like our minority business enterprises and making sure that they're more streamlined way. But it also just makes some very streamlined and kind of modern and moving through the process with more speed. While that also helps state operations, it helps save the state money in this tough budgetary environment. It also provides a greater incentive for contractors to work with the state and makes it easier for particularly small businesses to navigate through that process when they don't have a small army of attorneys that can come work with my colleagues and I. And so I think taken all together, these touch on different pieces. It is administrative action that we're approaching to executive orders and reorganization at various departments. It is accountability being set by the governor and really choosing what those leadership structures look like and the lines of accountability. But it's also the legislation and the budget that our hope truly is that this is a session that we think of as really turning the page towards a better business environment, the state, but also more buying their local this type of progress. So I know that was a lot and it was long, and I think we have just about 15 minutes left. So I will pause there, and Mark, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, great. Thank you, Brad. That was a lot, but again, it's only about the economy. And it's something that touches all of us. And as Brad talked about, some of the things that are being proposed are nuts and bolts, 3 yards in a cloud of dust, things that we don't appreciate, but what it makes things go in terms of, I thought the regulation, the Government Efficiency Commission is a big issue here at the chamber. There probably isn't a month that goes by that we don't get 4 or 5 calls from a member who has an issue. And the thing is like, well, what we need is a part of passes. It's pretty challenging. But anyway, let me stop and kind of open it up. If someone has a question, maybe if you can use the indicator for raise your hand, and I'll try and get to you. Who's got a question for Brad? I'll throw one out to get started a little bit. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about the apprenticeship programs and what you've heard in terms of dialogue or feedback from people. What industries or what job areas have you heard other than trades? Because I think we're familiar with the concept that, apprenticeships are in trades, but how about some other industries or jobs that you might have heard about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll do every team I've been over the last and see supporters of this is the Maryland Association of CPAs. It is a model that they believe deeply in, that this is a good pathway for accountants, and that it helps them at their individual firms bring that person on through the process so that not only are they getting that help through the process for that individual business, and it is a job, right? They're paying this person, but at the end of it, they have somebody that can hit the ground running right for tax season, right? And move all the way through. I mentioned cybersecurity and IT. There's been a ton of interest in those areas and continuing to build out. Community colleges, Howard Community College in particular, has really been intentional about building relationships with IT employers to set these things up, and something that we are really focused on continuing to expand out. And aerospace. Uh, I do work with community, whether it's around NASA, Goddard, uh, assembly, or the usage of even things like satellites to adopt this model and continue to scale it up. I actually believe that from a particular management point of view, we're going to see more interest in this. Royal Farms have come to the table several times. They now have a registered apprenticeship program for the managers of their stores that is picking up steam in a kind of a group employer sense. That if you learn kind of the baseline management skill set at, say, a Royal Farms, that may be translatable to a Walmart or a Target, right? And continuing to build out kind of our retail sector. So I think we're going to get innovative with it. We have some true believers. A state senator we work with named Jim Rosapet believes strongly that lawyers should just be apprentices and that no one needs to go to law school. So I don't know if we're quite there yet. We're really interested to see which sectors could on
Statement,
where.
appraisers and surveyors. That's an acquired skill that you just can't jump into, but becoming an apprentice and focus on that, I think would be helpful. So that's interesting. So yeah.
That's
So
a
who
great
else
point.
got a thought? You can put it in the comments, and I'll grab it, or I can field some questions here.
And no need to force any questions from my end, but I will put my email in the chat here. If anybody has any questions to follow up on anything, I'm happy to chat. So please feel free to reach out. I will tell you, it is not a burden. It is very helpful because I am in government, right? I am not operating a business. I am not in the private sector to make sure that as we were making these that were because it's always good to hear, even if it's just feedback, right? And not a direct needed question about what that relationship with the state has looked like. I have found that often that breakdown in communication is why issues, like you mentioned, Mark, the need for a chamber of common sense. It's often new to folks who are making those decisions to hear some of these problems because those communications just doesn't take place. So as issues like that come up, please be sparing on components of it, but I'm always happy to have conversations about kind of systemic problems like that.
Maybe you could speak a little bit about the bills that you have here, but tie it in a little bit to how we see the legislative session kind of winding up with the debates about money, taxes, soda tax. That was fun. That popped up this last week. Uh, 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 things like that, how the governors could survive or
It's a good question. As I mentioned, and I tend to be a worrier on things like this, so I hope I'm very wrong. But the next Bureau of Revenue estimates will be up next month. Just given what's going on in Washington and some of these layoffs, my concern is that our long-term revenue estimates are really going to take a hit as a result, given the disproportionate impact to Maryland's economy and candidly just some of the uncertainty because we're just modeling these things. Maryland, like most states, we have to balance our budget, and the way that we do that is that we estimate the revenue coming into the state and we estimate the costs the way that we have structured the budget, and those two things have to match by the 83rd day of session. If that comes way down, that revenue conversation is going to be continued, right? But I think that in all of this, we have been intentional, right? The General Assembly has been interested for a long time in things like combined reporting. It passed through the House combined reporting. It very much seems that the House is going to pass that again this year, though I don't know what will end up happening in state Senate. And you have some wonderful representatives here in Anne Arundel County that I've talked to quite a bit on this issue. What we have looked to do is say, okay, if something like this is going to have to move, let's make sure that we are being intentional about what we're actually doing with the tax base. If you're going to broaden the base, let's also reduce the rates. Something that we have been interested in as kind of the holy grail for a long time is lowering the corporate tax rate in the state, which obviously is difficult in this environment. When the governor indicated support for combined reporting, we also included a proposal to reduce the corporate tax rate by 26 base points to get under 8%, so that we are more competitive with folks heavily life science in
we're not a big fan of the combined reporting concept because I think it'll be actually a disincentive for people to come here and they'll probably stay in Massachusetts. But other things that we're seeing a bit of an out migration of retirees too, and part of that is a influx of retirees making higher income and the tax rates going up and maybe some folks moving out of state to tax friendlier states for nearby like Delaware. Um, and I know maybe it wasn't in the mix here, but any thought on what we could do to help retain, seniors in Maryland?
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult, right? I mentioned earlier that out migration to the state is being led by young folks, which is deeply, deeply concerning to me when I
Yeah.
think, a decade from now, what a balanced economy looks like in the approach that source, it really drops, right? Because at 770, it spikes again, right? Of folks leaving the state, and it is, of course, smaller than the previous group. There was, and Governor Hogan's last year gave a massive, massive tax cut. Candidly, it did contribute to where we are now. I don't know if it was a sustainable tax cut or COVID kind of endorsed there. But we did give the largest tax cut to seniors on their retirement. And we did not see a major impact to those migration patterns as a result. I think it's something that we are going to have to continue to focus on. But in the short term, given both the prospect of the impact of the federal government on the economy, but also just where we are on spending versus revenue, I think that long term, we have to make sure that we are improving people's lives through other means than just tax relief. Though I think that conversation that does look like and what that looks like long term. But it's also making some kind of baseline investments in infrastructure and quality of life to ensure that we have other compelling reasons for folks to stay in the state. I say that without, I don't mean to sound dismissive. I think it is on folks' minds, but just being very candid, I don't think that we're going to approach anything related to that, at least until the budget is right sized over the next couple of years.
And what's the date
Brad?
on the revenue report?
What was that? I'm sorry, Mark.
The next date on the revenue estimate you mentioned.
I believe it's March 1st each year. As I'm saying that, I think that might actually be a weekend. So it'll either be at the end of this month or the very beginning of March. I'm sure it'll probably be that Friday or Monday.
Okay. I think Scott, you had a question. Sound like.
Yeah, some industries seem to be getting, I'll say, picked on for lack of a better word, more the new car tax, not only upping the percentage, but then making it on the cost of the car without minusing the trade-in of any car or anything like that. Um, and I know taxes need to go up. I'm not going to argue that. But when I can have my driver's license for what is it, 8 years for less than $50 a year, um, I see certain things that and okay, now you had no control over this, but the steel tariffs and everything the federal government's putting out there, obviously it's going to make cars go through the roof. The cost of cars go through the roof. And maybe part of that's intentional to keep people from driving or make them drive less or buy less cars or whatever the case may be. But realistically, and you said it earlier, our mass transit is not where it needs to be pushing people off the street, limiting opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk about anything like that a little bit? Maybe looking at some of those things and saying, is that a realistic thing to do? I don't know.
That is not completely in my portfolio, though I'm privy to the conversations. So I do have some limitation in this, unfortunately. I would say overall, there was a lot of modeling done on how broad of a tax base we're kind of looking at as we have this revenues conversation. Of course, we have to balance two things, which is the kind of regressivity of things like the sales tax, for instance, which would be more sweeping in its applicability, but it also has a outsized impact on lower income folks just based off of their spending habits and how much they're pulling in. And so individual industries were selected over the long run based off of where the money is dedicated to. So, for instance, the all money that is paid into the source that you just mentioned go and not but the transportation trust, which is really things like that. That fund is in a bad place. There is most of the reason is because costs have significantly gone up for things just like road maintenance, but also we need to repair bridges, replace bridges. Obviously, there's a bridge in Baltimore we definitely have to replace, although we're getting some real federal government assistance on that one, thanks to a lot of lobbying on the governor's part of the federal government of both administrations. But we do not take from the general fund and put it in the transportation trust fund, just as we don't with the education fund. And so that was a place where it really necessitated those revenue sources to have to increase as we move forward. I say all that to say there was real intentionality into why the case that the new to this administration. The submits his budget. Now it's more like Congress. They submit it. There was a constitutional amendment that changed this. They submit the budget. The governor, in this case, submits the budget, and the legislature could scrap the whole thing and rewrite it. Now they won't do that, but it does mean that we have 90 days of a conversation in a very conspicuous way before the General Assembly. And so these types of conversations are almost by design, right? Folks should be coming to the table, explaining the direct impact and proposing alternatives when there are broader concerns, particularly as they involve external factors. Like you mentioned, Scott, the tariffs on steel that I do not think were I don't know that we knew what that was going to look like when we were drawing up this proposal. So that's a long way of saying I think it'll be a continued conversation, and I would encourage you to be able and kind of explain your perspective on it.
the hour of a presentation of the economic growth proposal. Anyone has any comments or thoughts for Brad? You've got the email. Please, I'm sure he'll love to hear from you all. And he does. I think input and dialogue is important as they frame the budget and the policies for economic development and job growth. In the meantime, what I'll do, I'll send out to you all kind of the little overview about the economic growth thing, so you'll have that. And everybody pay attention. We've got, I don't know how many more days till the end of session, but it's going to get interesting with a lot of conversation about budget cuts, tax increases, and so forth. And it's going to impact your business. So the Chamber's going to try and push that information out. And at some point, we may have another session like this to kind of give an update of what's going on. But again, our extreme thank you to Brad for taking the time sharing with us. So
Thanks for having me.